The call came in at 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday in November. Not a text. A call. And my sister only calls when something is broken beyond what a text can carry. I know the time because I still have the screenshot, 11:47 and 3 seconds p.m., 6 seconds of ringing before I answered, and in the background behind her voice, the sound of rain hitting what I would later learn was the roof of her car, parked at a gas station 2 miles from the house she had shared with her husband for 9 years. She hadn't been allowed back inside to get her coat. I want you to sit with that for a moment because it is the sentence that starts everything else. 9 years of a marriage. And the last thing she owned in that house, a coat hanging by the front door that she had owned since before she met him, was not worth opening the door for. That was the night I started keeping a file. Welcome back to Family Revenge Stories New, the channel where quiet people keep the receipts and family learns that boundaries have a price. If stories about dignity, documents, and consequences are your kind of thing, drop a comment and subscribe. We're just getting started. My name Olivia Bennett. I spent 8 years in the United States Army, military intelligence. I won't go further than that, but I will tell you this. The Army teaches you 2 things about a situation before anything else. First, you assess the terrain. Second, you identify what your opponent believes you are incapable of. Those 2 pieces of information held together are almost always enough. When I got out, I became a paralegal. I specialize now in estate and probate law at a firm that handles exactly the kind of disputes my family was about to hand me. Wills, trusts, contested transfers of property, the paperwork of dying and the arguments left behind. I read documents for a living. I read them the way other people read faces, looking for what was meant versus what was written, for what was promised versus what was signed. I have held a last will and testament in my hands and known, within 3 minutes, exactly who in that room was going to walk out furious. My family did not think about any of this when they decided what to do to my sister. They thought about what they saw when they looked at me. A woman who was quiet, who showed up early and left late, who didn't make scenes at Christmas dinner, who absorbed the heat when things went wrong, who could be relied upon to smooth things over and ask for nothing in return. They had watched me do this for 38 years and they had mistaken the silence for softness. Calm is not the same thing as weak. My family had confused the 2 my entire life. My sister, I'll call her Mara, which is not her name but is close enough to the weight of it, was 2 years younger than me and had spent most of her adult life trying to make herself small enough to be loved without effort. She was the kind of woman who apologized for crying. She had married Derek when she was 29, at a wedding our parents paid for down to the centerpieces, and she had spent the 9 years since then in a house his parents helped fund, raising 2 children, working part-time at a veterinary clinic because Derek felt that full-time work made her unavailable to the family. I want to be precise here. Derek was not a monster in the way that's easy to identify. He didn't leave marks. He left absences. He left silence where encouragement should have been. He left her name off accounts, for simplicity. He made decisions about their lives and presented them to her as whether things that were simply happening, not choices he was making. He had been doing this for 9 years and the people in our family who saw it had found it easier to say Mara was sensitive than to say Derek was building walls. Our father was alive during most of this. He saw it. He saw more than he said, and when he died 18 months before that Tuesday night in November, he did something about it quietly, in the way of a man who had spent 40 years watching and measuring and saying nothing until the moment it counted. I didn't know what he'd done yet. None of us did. That was the point. The Tuesday night in November started with an argument about Mara's mother-in-law. Derek's mother, I will call her Patricia because that is her actual name and she has earned it, had been making noises for several months about moving in. Not visiting. Moving in. Into the house. Into the guest room that Mara had converted into a small art space for herself, the only room in the house that was entirely hers. Patricia had a perfectly serviceable condo 20 minutes away and 2 other adult children with spare rooms, but she had decided that Mara's house was the right arrangement, and Derek had decided not to disagree with his mother. Mara told me she had asked calmly to discuss it first, that she had said she needed to understand the timeline, the plan, what it would mean for the children's schedule, whether Patricia would be contributing to household expenses. She had said this over dinner on a Tuesday night in November, and Derek had told her she was being unwelcoming. He had said his mother had always found Mara difficult. He had said, and Mara quoted this to me word for word at 11:47 p.m. from a gas station in the rain. "If you can't make room for my family, maybe this isn't the right house for you." And then he had told her to get out until she was ready to apologize. She had her purse. She had her phone. She had the clothes she was wearing. He had not let her get her coat. I drove to that gas station in 22 minutes. I found her in the front seat of her car, soaked through the collar, with her hands wrapped around a paper cup of gas station coffee that had already gone cold. She wasn't crying. She had finished crying in the parking lot before she called me, because that was how Mara handled things. She used up the feeling first so she could talk without it. I sat in the passenger seat. I looked at the rain on the windshield. I said, "Tell me everything. Start at the beginning." She talked for 40 minutes. I listened. I did not say what I was thinking. What I was thinking required a legal pad and a certain amount of time alone with the documents our father had left, which I had not yet opened because I had not yet understood why they would matter. I understood now. I drove her to my house. I made her tea she didn't drink. I set her up in my guest room, which has always been her room, which has always been kept ready because some part of me knew. Then I went to my home office, unlocked the bottom drawer of my filing cabinet, and pulled out the folder our father's attorney had given me 11 months earlier. The one labeled in my father's handwriting in blue ballpoint pen simply, "For when." I had asked his attorney what that meant, for when. She had said, "Your father was very specific. He said you would know." I sat down. I opened the folder. I read everything 3 times. My father had been a quiet man who ran a hardware store for 31 years. He was not wealthy in the way people mean when they say wealthy. He was wealthy in the way that means he owned things outright, he never borrowed what he could save for, and he had been watching the terrain of his family for decades the way I had been trained to watch terrain, looking for the fault lines, the assumptions, the places where someone believed they already knew the answer. The folder contained 3 things. The first was a promissory note, signed and notarized, dated 11 years prior, 2 years before Mara's wedding. It was a loan from my father to Derek's parents, the Hallerans, in the amount of $47,000. The loan had been framed at the time as a family gesture. Derek's parents had been in a difficult financial period, and my father had offered to help because it was, he said, the right thing to do and because he wanted to start the marriage on stable ground. The note carried a modest interest rate. It had a repayment term. It had never been repaid. Not one payment had ever been made. The Hallerans had told my father, apparently, that they considered it a gift. My father had nodded and said nothing and kept the signed promissory note in a fireproof safe for 11 years. The second item was a deed. My father had purchased 8 years ago a small parcel of land, 43 acres about 90 minutes from our family home, in Mara's name alone. Not jointly with Derek. Not in the family trust. In Mara's name recorded at the county recorder's office, sitting clean and uncontested in the public record. Derek didn't know. Mara didn't know. The property had a small structure on it, a hunting cabin essentially, and my father had been quietly paying the property taxes for 8 years, listed in the annual statements I had been receiving as executor of his estate as a line item I had, to my own embarrassment, not yet looked at closely enough to trace. The third item was a letter. Handwritten. 4 pages. Addressed to me. I will not read all of it. But I will tell you what the last paragraph said because my father wrote it in the kind of plain language that doesn't need translation. "I have watched Derek Halloran take from your sister without her knowing the accounts were open. I have watched his mother teach him that women who ask questions are difficult and women who comply are rewarded. I have watched Mara make herself smaller every year. I could not make her see it while I was living, she would have defended him. But I could arrange it so that when she was ready to leave, she would not leave empty-handed. The land is hers. The note is collectible. Use your judgment about when." I sat with that letter for a long time. I did not call anyone. I went to my computer and I opened a new document and I began to log everything Mara had told me, with timestamps and direct quotes, organized by category. Financial control, isolation behaviors, incident record, witness names. I had done this kind of documentation in other contexts. The discipline was the same. I saved the file. I opened a second file for the legal strategy. I did not sleep. The Hallorans moved fast. Once they understood something had changed. Took them 11 days. On the 12th day after the gas station, Derek called Mara to tell her she could come home, if she was ready to behave like an adult, and she had told him very quietly that she was speaking with an attorney. He had laughed. He had said, and she recorded this because I had asked her to record everything and she had listened, "You don't have any money for an attorney. Stop performing." 3 days after that, Patricia called me. This was unexpected. Patricia and I had always had the kind of relationship that functions on polite surfaces, holiday greetings, careful topics, a mutual understanding that we saw each other's role in the family very differently. She called on a Sunday afternoon and she was warm in a way that had a temperature behind it, and she said she was hoping I could talk some sense into Mara, that this was a family matter, that Derek was devastated, that the children needed their mother at home, that sometimes marriages went through rough patches and the people who loved both parties needed to help them through it. I let her talk for a while. Then I said, "Patricia, I have a question. The $47,000 my father loaned your family in 2013. Do you remember the terms of that arrangement?" There was a pause that lasted 4 seconds. I counted. "That was settled between the families," she said. "A long time ago." I said. "I'll have to look into that. Thank you for calling." I hung up. I called our firm's senior attorney, who was also a friend, and I said, "I need you to draft 2 letters. The first is a formal demand on a promissory note. The second is a notice of separate property to be included in a divorce filing." She said, "Tell me everything." I did. If you have ever watched the people who couldn't spare a single afternoon to help suddenly find all the time in the world once they realized money was on the table, you already know where this is going. Stay with me. 2 weeks later, Derek's family organized a dinner. They framed it as a reconciliation. A chance for the family, meaning Derek's family and our mother, who had been carefully cultivated by Patricia over the preceding weeks, to sit down together and talk through the situation. Mara had been told she was welcome to attend. She was told this by our mother, who used the phrase "everyone just wants peace," which is the phrase people use when they want you to surrender without calling it that. Mara called me the night before. She asked if she should go. I said, "I'll go with you." She asked what I was going to do. I said, "I'm going to bring a folder." The dinner was at the Hallorans' house. Patricia had set the dining room table with cloth napkins and the good china. There were 12 people. Derek and his 2 siblings and their spouses, Patricia and her husband Frank, our mother, Mara's 2 closest friends who had been invited, I assumed, to serve as witnesses to Mara's capitulation, and me. Derek's brother gave a small toast before the food was served. He talked about family. He talked about the importance of not letting lawyers get involved in what were essentially private matters. He talked about the children, he said their names, and the damage that prolonged conflict would cause them. He looked at Mara while he said this, not at Derek. Then Patricia spoke. She had notes. She read from them with the confidence of someone who had already written the ending. She talked about the house, Derek's house she called it twice, and about the children's school district and about how disruption at this stage in their development would have lasting consequences. She talked about what a reasonable resolution might look like. The word reasonable did a lot of work in her speech. It meant Mara goes home. The subject closes. Things return to how they were, except now Mara has been shown what happens when she asks questions. She finished. She looked at me. She said pleasantly, "I know you've always looked out for Mara, and I hope you'll help her see what makes sense here." I looked at her for a moment. I looked at Derek, who was leaning back in his chair with the posture of someone who had already won. I said, "I'd like a few minutes if that's all right." They gave it to me because they thought I was going to manage my sister into compliance. I could see it in the way the tension in the room relaxed slightly when I reached into my bag. They expected paperwork from a therapist, a parenting plan, something soft. I placed the promissory note on the table. I said, "This is a promissory note signed by Franklin and Patricia Halloran, witnessed and notarized, dated March 14, 2013. The principal amount is $47,000. The interest rate is 3.2% annually. The repayment term was 5 years. As of this month, the outstanding balance including accrued interest is $54,611. I turned it to face Patricia. No payments have been recorded. My father kept meticulous records. These are the bank statements showing no corresponding deposits. I set the bank statements beside the note. This is now an active collection under his estate, of which I am executor. Patricia said. That was not a loan, that was. I said. It has his signature and yours. It was notarized by a woman named Carol Briggs who still practices in this county. We've already been in touch with her. Frank started to say something. I didn't look at him. I placed the property deed on the table. This is a recorded deed to 43 acres in Blaine County, transferred to Mara 8 years ago, held in her name solely. It is her separate property under state law. It is not a marital asset. It is not subject to division. It is hers. I looked at Derek. It was never in your name. It was never in your account. You were never told because my father made a judgment call about what you would do with information you hadn't earned. Derek said slowly. What is that supposed to mean? I said. It means exactly what it says. His sister, the one who had always been quieter than the others, who I had noticed watching the room rather than performing for it, looked at the deed and then at Mara and pressed her lips together. She didn't speak. I noted it. Derek's volume was rising. He said this was not a negotiation, that I had no standing here, that the children's needs superseded whatever game I was playing, that my father had always undermined his marriage, that Mara was being manipulated by a lawyer who was billing by the hour for this circus. I waited. I let the sentence run out the way water runs out of a cup. Then I placed the last item on the table. It was not a document. It was a photograph, 8.5 by 11, printed at the office, taken at a family gathering 4 summers ago. In the photograph, Derek was standing with his arm around a woman who was not Mara at an event in his office parking lot. The timestamp from the photo's metadata was 7:43 p.m. on a Friday night, when he had told Mara he was working late. I had not gone looking for this photograph. It had been in a folder Mara gave me when she came to stay with me, a folder she had kept quietly for 2 years without knowing why, only knowing the habit from watching me. She had been doing what I did. She just hadn't known what to do with it yet. I said, I'm not going to explain this one. The room was quiet. I looked at Derek's sister, the one with the pressed lips and the watching eyes. I said quietly, I know this is not what you wanted for any of them. She said nothing. She gave me one small nod. Picked up my folder. I straightened the papers. Mara will be in touch with Derek through our firm. The children's schedule will be arranged through the standard process. The promissory note demand letter was sent by certified mail yesterday afternoon. I looked at Patricia. You should have it by Thursday. I looked at my mother, who had not spoken since the toast. She had the expression of someone who had been told the weather was one thing and had gone outside to find it was another. I said, Mom. She blinked. I said, he didn't let her get her coat. I picked up my bag. I walked to the door. Mara was already standing. The divorce took 14 months. The promissory note settled for $51,200, slightly discounted because collection is never clean, but enough to matter, enough to fund Mara's legal fees and the first year of the children's college savings accounts she opened the week the check cleared. The 43 acres in Blaine County are hers. There is a plan now to eventually build something on them, not the hunting cabin which is being repaired but something livable. Something that has only her name on the deed. The children call it the farm, which is generous, but children are generous like that. Derek received the marital home in the division and a mortgage he cannot easily service on a single income. Patricia moved into the guest room within 6 weeks of the divorce filing. The timeline I found poetic, even if I did not say so. Derek's sister, her name is Renata, called Mara 3 months after the dinner. She did not apologize for her family. She apologized for herself, for what she had seen and not named. It was not enough and it was something. Mara accepted it the way you accept a partial payment, with acknowledgement that the account is still open. Our mother went to therapy for the first time at the age of 67. She called me after her third session and said, "I think I have been confusing peace with silence for most of my life." I did not say anything. I let her have the sentence. It had taken her a long time to earn it. The folder, my father's folder, the one labeled for when in blue ballpoint pen, sits in the same bottom drawer. I have added to it the settlement agreement, the filed deed, the satisfaction of the promissory note. The letter is still there. I read it sometimes, not for information, but because my father wrote in the way men who are running out of time write, as if every word has been weight-tested before it was set down. Mara is renting a house 7 minutes from mine. She has a room that is entirely hers. She keeps her coat by the front door. There is a thing my father used to say when I came home from my first deployment, when I was still learning that the hardest part of service was not the doing but the returning, the adjusting of the eyes to what home actually was versus what you've been carrying of it. He said, "You can't pay a debt you didn't know was on the books. But once you know, you owe it." He spent 11 years quietly, patiently, making sure that when the day came, Mara would not leave empty-handed. He hadn't forgotten she had a sister either. If this reminded you that the people watching quietly are sometimes the ones who have been preparing longest, take that with you. If you know someone who's been carrying weight that was never theirs to carry, remind them that there are people in the world who keep the receipts and know how to use them. Drop a comment, hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.